Margaret Holloway pressed both palms flat against the train window and stared at the man waiting on that platform, the man who had agreed to marry her without ever seeing her face, and she watched his expression collapse the moment he saw her step down from that car. Not a flinch, not a blink, a full visible collapse, like something had just given up on a dream he hadn't even admitted he was still carrying. She had prepared herself for this. She had practiced not feeling it. But standing there on that Montana platform in the August heat, gripping two worn leather bags that held everything she owned in this world, with every pair of eyes on that platform cutting into her like a cold blade, she felt it anyway. Every single inch of it. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a single chapter. And drop a comment telling me what city or town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Margaret, because what happens next on that platform is something none of those people in Harlan Creek, Montana would ever forget for the rest of their lives. Caleb Whitaker had been standing on that platform since 1:15 in the afternoon. He'd told himself it was practical. He didn't want to miss the train, didn't want to leave a woman stranded in a town that wasn't known for its hospitality toward strangers. That was what he'd told himself. But the truth, the one he hadn't spoken aloud to a single soul, was that he'd been nervous in a way he hadn't felt since the first time he'd sat across from a bank officer asking for a loan he wasn't sure he'd get. His palms had been dry that day. They weren't dry now. He wasn't a man who spent much time examining his own feelings. He was 41 years old and had built most of what he had through work rather than reflection. Whitaker Ranch was 312 acres of Montana land that he had broken his back over for the better part of 2 decades, and there wasn't a fence post on that property that didn't carry some memory of sweat and sacrifice in its grain. He was proud of it, or he had been proud of it, back when pride still felt like something worth holding onto. The last 2 years had changed things. His foreman, a solid man named Pete Delacroix, had left for Wyoming after a disagreement over wages Caleb couldn't stretch to cover. 3 of his best hands had followed Pete out the door within the month. The cook, an older man named Gibbs, had started showing up to the kitchen half-drunk by 9 in the morning, and the meals he produced reflected exactly the kind of care a half-drunk man gives to other people's dinner. The ranch hands ate what was put in front of them and said nothing, because that was the kind of men they were, men who had stopped expecting better. The cattle numbers were down. Not catastrophically, not yet, but enough that Caleb had started doing the kind of arithmetic at his desk at night that kept a man awake staring at the ceiling. He'd taken out a loan he shouldn't have taken the previous spring, and the interest was sitting on top of everything else like a stone he couldn't stop carrying. He wasn't a desperate man. He refused to use that word even in his own thoughts. But he was a man who had assessed his situation with the same clear eyes he used to assess his land, and what he'd seen was a ranch that needed something he couldn't provide alone. He'd needed someone who could bring order to a household that had been running without one for too long. Someone who could manage a kitchen, manage a budget, stretch supplies through a hard winter, and not complain about it. He had not been looking for romance. He had been looking for a solution. The mail order arrangement had been his foreman's idea, actually not Pete, but the new man, a younger fellow named Garrett who had more opinions than experience and wasn't shy about sharing either. Garrett had left a worn newspaper on Caleb's desk one morning, folded open to a column of correspondence advertisements with no comment and no explanation. Caleb had left it there unread for 3 days before picking it up. He'd read through it with the kind of detachment he gave to livestock reports, and then he'd gone to bed, and then he'd come back to it in the morning, and by the end of that week he had written a letter to a placement service in Philadelphia. He had specified practical things. He had asked for a woman who knew how to cook and keep accounts. He had asked for someone hard-working and not afraid of rough conditions. He had not specified anything about appearance, because it had not seemed relevant to what he was asking for. Margaret Holloway had been the woman the service recommended. Her letter had been straightforward and without affectation. She'd written that she was 29 years old, that she had spent the last 6 years keeping house for her widowed father and 2 younger brothers. That she knew how to stretch a food budget and preserve for winter, and manage a household of working men. She had not written a single word about herself, beyond what was practical and useful, and that restraint had impressed him more than any amount of flattery might have. He had written back. She had written back. 3 letters total, and in the third one she had agreed to come to Montana. He had not asked for a photograph, and she had not offered one. Standing on that platform now, watching the train doors open, he had told himself again what he had been telling himself for weeks. This was a business arrangement. A partnership of necessity. The details of the woman's appearance were as irrelevant to the arrangement as the color of a good horse. He had believed that. He had genuinely believed it, right up until the moment the doors opened and the passengers began descending, and he saw her. She came down the steps last, after all the other passengers had cleared the platform. She was a large woman, heavy-set, with a round face that was flushed from the heat of the train car, dressed in a blue cotton dress that had been mended at both cuffs, and was a season or two past its best condition. She carried 2 bags, one in each hand, and she carried them herself without looking for anyone to help her. Her dark hair was pinned up but coming loose at the temples. She was scanning the platform with a steady, careful gaze, the kind of gaze that was taking inventory, rather than seeking reassurance. When her eyes found him, and they found him quickly, with a directness that he hadn't expected, she didn't smile and she didn't flinch. She just looked at him for a long moment, the way a person looks at something they need to make an accurate assessment of, and then she walked toward him. He was aware, in the way a man is always aware of the eyes around him in a town he's lived in for 2 decades, that the platform had gone quieter. He was aware of Jim Hasley from the feed store standing with 2 of his workers and saying something that made them laugh low and mean. He was aware of the Caldwell sisters near the post office window, their heads bent toward each other, their eyes on the woman walking across the platform. He tipped his hat when she reached him. "Miss Holloway." "Mr. Whitaker." Her voice was even and clear, no tremor in it. "I appreciate you meeting the train. Wasn't any trouble." He glanced at her bags. "Can I take those? I've got 'em." She said it without sharpness, just as a statement of fact. "Is there somewhere to leave my things while we sort out whatever needs sorting?" He nodded and turned toward the wagon, and she fell into step beside him without hesitation, and that was that. No ceremony, no pretense of ease that neither of them felt. Just 2 people with a practical arrangement between them, walking through a town that was watching and whispering behind both of their backs. He didn't hear what Jim Hasley said when they passed. He caught one word, "fat," and he felt his jaw set in a way it hadn't set in a long time, something cold and sharp moving through him. But he kept walking, because making a scene on the main street of Harlan Creek on the day his mail-order bride arrived was not something he was willing to do to either of them. Margaret heard it too. He knew she heard it because he saw the very slight change in the angle of her chin, a fraction upward, a setting of the jaw that matched his own. But she didn't break her stride. She didn't look toward the voice. She just kept walking, and that told him something he hadn't expected to learn about her in the first 4 minutes of their acquaintance. The wagon ride out to the ranch was mostly quiet. She sat with her bags at her feet and looked at the land as they moved through it, and he drove and offered what information seemed useful: how far the ranch was, what the conditions were like, that she'd have her own room, and he wouldn't make any demands that weren't part of their agreement. He said that last part carefully and without looking at her, because it needed to be said, and he hadn't figured out a graceful way to say it. She said, "I appreciate that, Mr. Whitaker. I wasn't expecting anything different." He didn't know exactly what he'd expected her to say to that. Something softer, maybe. Something more uncertain. What she said instead landed with the clean weight of a woman who had already figured out where she stood and was fine with it. "You said in your letter you've kept accounts," he said after a while. "I have. 6 years of them." She didn't elaborate, but there was something in the way she said it, not pride exactly, but a solid matter-of-factness that made him think the accounts had been kept well. "The ranch books are a mess," he said. He hadn't planned to admit that so quickly. "I'm not a man who's good with figures. I'm good with cattle and I'm good with land. but the numbers I let them get away from me." She turned her head and looked at him for a moment. "How far away from you did they get?" he told her. "Not all of it, not the loan specifically, but enough the cost that had climbed past the income. The ways money had been hemorrhaging out of the household without anyone tracking where it went, the cook's waste. The supply orders that had been duplicated without anyone noticing." He told her with the plain straightforwardness of a man who has given up on pretending things are better than they are. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "I'll need to see the books within the first week." "You'll have them. And the kitchen. Tonight if you want." She nodded, looking back at the road ahead. "I've worked with harder situations than that." He didn't ask what harder situations meant. He thought he understood something about it from her letters, from the way she wrote about her father and her brothers, from the matter-of-fact way she described years of managing a household that hadn't been easy. There were stories in those letters she hadn't told, and he didn't reach for them. They arrived at the ranch in the early evening, and the hands were coming in from the day's work when the wagon pulled up. Caleb climbed down and came around to help with her bags, but she already had them. He let that go. The men gathered in that loose, uncertain way men gather when something unexpected is happening, and they haven't decided yet what to make of it. There were 7 of them at present, down from the 11 he'd had 2 summers ago. Garrett, the youngest at 22, had a face that showed everything he was thinking without his permission. And what it was showing right now was the particular disappointment of a young man who had built up an idea of something in his head and was watching it fail to match reality. Roy Bendon, who was 44 and had worked for Caleb for 9 years, kept his expression carefully neutral, which was its own kind of commentary. The rest ranged between those two positions in ways that weren't difficult to read. "This is Miss Holloway," Caleb said. "She'll be managing the household. I expect you'll treat her accordingly." Some hats came off. Some didn't. Margaret stood with her bags and looked at each man in turn with that same steady inventory-taking gaze she'd used on the platform. She didn't smile, and she didn't shrink. She said, "I look forward to getting to know all of you." And she said it with the kind of calm that suggested she had assessed the situation and was not concerned about it. Garrett said something under his breath to the man beside him, a young cowpoke named Danny Walsh, who was new enough that he was still trying to figure out which way the wind blew on this ranch. Danny Walsh laughed before catching himself. Margaret turned her head slightly in their direction and said nothing, but Caleb noticed that she located the 2 of them precisely in her memory in that moment and filed them there. He showed her inside. The house was a 2-story structure with 4 rooms downstairs and 3 up. Solid but not fine, built for function rather than comfort. The kitchen was at the back, and he watched her face when she saw it. Gibbs had left it in his usual condition pots that hadn't been properly cleaned, a work table thick with the kind of residue that accumulates when no one has cared about scrubbing in some time. A pantry that was a confusion of unlabeled jars, and a smell that suggested something had been left too long at some point. Her expression didn't change in the way he'd expected, no visible horror, no moment of reassessment. She just walked to the pantry, opened it, looked inside for a long, careful moment, and said, "What time do the men eat in the morning?" 5:30, he said. "And Gibbs, where is he?" "I let him go 2 weeks ago." He said it flat, because it was the kind of thing that had taken him too long to do and he wasn't proud of the delay. "I've been managing since, with 2 of the hands taking turns." "What have you been feeding them?" "Salt pork. Some beans. Biscuits when anyone felt like making them." She turned from the pantry and looked at him. It wasn't judgment exactly, but it wasn't nothing either. "Are these men still willing to work for you?" "Some of them are thinking about leaving," he admitted. "I know it." She nodded slowly, still looking at the pantry. "I'll need a full inventory of what's here, and I'll need to know what your supply budget allows per week." "I'll tell you. Tonight?" "Tonight," he said. She set her bags down by the kitchen door, not upstairs, not in the room he'd designated for her, but right there by the kitchen door, and she said, "Then show me where you keep the accounts and let's start there." He had expected, somewhere in the back of his mind, to show her to her room and let her rest from the journey, the way it seemed like a reasonable thing to do for a woman who'd been on a train for the better part of 3 days. He had expected at least one evening before the practical realities descended. But she was already pulling open drawers looking for a pen, and he understood that rest was not what she'd come to Montana for. He brought her the account books. He was not proud of what was in them. She sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp and opened the first ledger without ceremony, and she began to read. He sat across from her, because it seemed like the right thing to do, and he watched her work through the numbers with a focused precision that was remarkable in its quietness. She didn't gasp. She didn't make sounds of dismay. She turned pages and occasionally made a small notation in the margin with the pen he'd given her, and her face showed nothing except concentration. After 20 minutes, she said, "Without looking up, you're losing roughly $40 a month more than you think you are." He sat very still, mostly. Duplicate orders in March and again in June that were never caught. And the hay cost someone charged you for a full delivery in April that the accounts show wasn't actually completed. Do you have the receipts? Somewhere. You'll need them. She turned another page. Also, your kitchen costs since January have been running about 60% over what a household this size should be spending. Which means either the prices jumped or someone was letting things go to waste at a rate that's hard to justify. She paused. Both things can be fixed, can they? She looked up at him then, and for the first time something shifted in her expression, not softness exactly, but a kind of directness that held something steadier underneath it. Mr. Whitaker, I didn't come to Montana to tell you your problems aren't solvable. I came to help you solve them. That's what I told you I'd do in my letters, and that's what I intend to do. But I need you to understand that it won't look neat at first. Finding out where money has been going is not a comfortable process. I'm not looking for comfortable, he said. Good, she looked back at the ledger. Then we're already ahead of where I thought we'd be. He didn't know what to make of that. He went to bed that night at 10 o'clock and lay on his back looking at the ceiling for longer than usual, not in the anxious arithmetic way he'd been spending his nights lately, but in a different way entirely, the way a man lies awake when something has happened that he needs to process before he can properly rest. She had been on his ranch for approximately 4 hours, and she had already found $40 a month in losses that he hadn't known about. He heard movement in the kitchen below him at 5 o'clock the next morning, when it was still dark outside. He smelled coffee first. Real coffee, not the flat, scorched version Gibbs had produced. Then something else bred, he thought, though he couldn't be sure in his half-awake state. He lay there for a minute, listening to the sounds of someone working in his kitchen with a kind of purposeful efficiency that hadn't occupied that room in a very long time, and then he got up and dressed and went downstairs. She was moving between the stove and the work table with the focused economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times. The kitchen was clean, not just clean but reorganized, the kind of reorganization that could only have happened while he was asleep, which meant she had been up for at least an hour before the 5 o'clock he was registering now. The work table surface was clear and scrubbed. The pots were arranged by size. The smell in the room was entirely different from the smell of the previous evening, something warm and yeasty and entirely different from the kitchen's usual character. You don't have to do this today, he said from the doorway. You just arrived. She looked up briefly. The men need to eat at 5:30. It's 5 o'clock, I know, but you traveled 3 days. You should rest. I'll rest when there's time. She turned back to the stove. Do you take your coffee with anything? He said no, and she handed him a cup without ceremony and went back to what she was doing, and he leaned against the doorframe and drank the coffee and watched. She moved in that kitchen like she'd been in it for years, not tentatively or with the false confidence of someone performing competence, but with the real article, the genuine ease of a woman who knew what she was doing and wasn't looking for anyone's approval of the fact. He had hired her because he needed a housekeeper and a cook. He was beginning to understand that was not precisely what he had gotten. The men came in at 5:30 to a table they didn't recognize. There were eggs done properly, not rubbery, not underdone, But exactly right. There was bread that was hot from the oven, with something applied to it that smelled like it might involve honey, and possibly a spice of some kind that Caleb could not identify, but that smelled like a memory of something good. There was a thick gravy in a pot at the center of the table, and biscuits that were not the dense, unleavened objects Gibbs had been producing. There was oatmeal with something stirred into it that made it look different from every other bowl of oatmeal these men had encountered on this ranch. Roy Bendon sat down and looked at his plate for a full 3 seconds before he picked up his fork. Then he put a bite in his mouth and chewed and swallowed and said nothing. But he ate the whole plate before he got up, and Roy Bendon had not finished a full plate in this kitchen in longer than anyone could easily remember. Danny Walsh, who was 20 years old and had not yet learned to conceal his reaction, said, "What, who made this?" "Miss Holloway," Caleb said. Danny Walsh looked toward the kitchen door with an expression that was several complex things at once, because 20-year-old Danny Walsh had been one of the ones standing behind Garrett the previous evening making a joke he wasn't proud of now. He looked at his plate and then back at the door, and then he picked up his fork and ate with the careful attention of a man who is having his assumptions rearranged for him, one bite at a time. Garrett ate without comment, which for Garrett was remarkable. After breakfast, while the men were pulling on their coats and heading out to the day's work, Roy Bendon stopped in the kitchen doorway. Margaret was already cleaning up, moving through the post-meal disorder with the same efficient economy she'd applied to everything else. Roy held his hat in his hands and turned it slowly by the brim and said, "Ma'am, that was the best meal I've had in this house in 2 years." She looked up at him. "Thank you, Mr. Bendon." Roy Bendon once. "I've been on the ranch 9 years. I was thinking about leaving." She waited. "I reckon I'll stay a while longer," he said. "See how things go." He put his hat on and went out. Caleb, who had been standing in the hallway within earshot and had told himself he wasn't eavesdropping, went out the front door feeling something shift in his chest, in a way that wasn't comfortable but wasn't bad. The first week moved quickly. Margaret was awake before anyone else and asleep after everyone. She inventoried the pantry and produced a written list for Caleb within 48 hours, not just what was there, but what was useless, what was wasted, what needed to be sourced differently and at better prices. She had already identified 2 suppliers that Gibbs had been using who were, in her polite but plainly stated assessment, overcharging for inferior goods. And she had found the names of alternatives in a paper directory she'd apparently packed along with her 2 bags. "How did you know to bring a supply directory?" he asked her. She looked at him steadily. "You told me in your letters that the ranch was struggling. I thought it was likely the purchasing side was part of the problem." I came prepared. He didn't have anything to say to that. He ordered from her list. The meals that week were not extravagant. She was working with what was available, stretching the budget in ways he hadn't thought to stretch it. And she showed him with numbers how every meal she produced cost less than Gibbs's version while feeding the men better. She kept a running log of costs per meal, per man, per day, and on Thursday evening she set it in front of him at the kitchen table with her evening coffee and said, "You're already saving $14 over what you spent last week." He looked at the log. The numbers were neat and clear and unmistakable. In 4 days, she confirmed. "By the end of the month, if the supply orders come through from the new sources, I expect that to be closer to $60. Yes. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. She was sitting with her own coffee, her hands wrapped around the cup, watching him without expression. She was wearing the same blue dress she'd arrived in, but she'd added a clean white apron that she must have produced from somewhere in her bags. He said, "Miss Holloway, I have to be honest with you." "Please be." "When I got your letter, I had ideas about how this would go. What you'd be, what this arrangement would look like." He paused. "I wasn't prepared." She tilted her head slightly. "For what? For someone who would sit down with my account books on her first night here and find $40 in losses I'd missed." He paused again. "For someone who would reorganize my kitchen at 5 in the morning after a 3-day train journey." For he stopped and started again. You told me in your letters you were experienced and hardworking. I believed you. I just didn't understand yet what that actually meant." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Mr. Whitaker, people have been underestimating what I'm capable of my whole life. I've learned not to waste time correcting them." She picked up her coffee. "I find it's more efficient to just do the work." The silence that followed was a comfortable one, which surprised him. He had not had a comfortable silence in his own house in a long time. Outside, the summer dark had settled over the ranch. From somewhere in the yard, he could hear two of the hands talking, their voices carrying in the night air without words, just the sound of men at ease in a way they hadn't been at ease in months. Earlier, that evening, he'd seen three of them sitting on the bunkhouse steps after supper, instead of disappearing straight inside the way they'd been doing, and he had understood something about what that meant. She wasn't just feeding them. She was reminding them that someone gave a damn. On a ranch where that had been in short supply, it turned out that was worth more than he'd known how to measure. He thought about the platform in town, the way Jim Hasley had laughed. The Caldwell sisters with their heads together. He thought about Garrett's expression when the wagon pulled up, and Danny Walsh's laugh that had cut off when it occurred to him it might not be the right response. He thought about Roy Bendon, who had been on this ranch 9 years, and had been thinking about leaving, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands. He said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him, waiting. "Not for anything specific I did to you, but for," he searched for the right words and didn't entirely find them. "When I saw you on that platform, I had a moment. I don't think I hit it well." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No, you didn't. I'm sorry for that." She turned her coffee cup slowly in both hands, looking at it rather than at him. "Mr. Whitaker, I've stepped off more platforms than this one. I know what that moment looks like on a man's face. I knew it was coming, and I came anyway." She looked up. "That should tell you something about what I think of myself." He held her gaze. "It tells me a great deal," he said. Something shifted between them in that moment, not romance, not yet, nothing that declared itself so simply. But a recognition, the kind that happens between two people who are for the first time actually seeing each other, rather than looking at what they expected to find. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere past the north pasture. Inside, the lamp burned low and steady, and the kitchen smelled like bread and coffee. And for the first time in a long time, Caleb Whitaker sat in his own house and felt something that might have been given enough time to grow into itself, something close to hope. He didn't know yet what Nathaniel Crow was planning. He didn't know that in less than 4 weeks a man from the next county over would arrive at his gate with a lawyer and a forged water rights claim, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't know that the same woman sitting across from him now, drinking coffee and keeping accounts in her careful, clean handwriting, was the thing that would stand between him and losing everything he had spent his life building. He didn't know any of that yet. He just knew that the ranch felt different tonight than it had felt in years, and that the difference had walked off a train in a blue cotton dress carrying 2 old bags, and that whatever he had expected when he'd written that first letter to Philadelphia, this was not it. This was something he didn't have a name for yet, but he was starting to think he might want to find one. The morning Roy Bendon stayed was the morning everything started to shift. Not dramatically, not in the way that gets remembered and retold around a fire, but in the quiet, accumulating way that real change always moves one small thing after another, until the weight of all those small things becomes something nobody can ignore anymore. Margaret noticed it first in the way the men came to breakfast. The second day, 3 of them had actually arrived a few minutes early, standing outside the kitchen door in the cold morning air, rather than dragging themselves in at the last possible moment the way they'd been doing under Gibbs. The third day, 5 of them. By the end of the first week, all 7 of Caleb's hands were at the table by 5:25, hats off, without anyone telling them to be. She didn't comment on it. She just kept cooking. But she watched everything. That was something Caleb was beginning to understand about Margaret Holloway. She watched everything. She forgot nothing. and she was running a calculation in her head at all times that was several steps ahead of whatever the visible situation appeared to be. On the 8th day, she found the water ledger. It wasn't in the account books Caleb had shown her. It was tucked behind a loose board in the pantry, which she discovered when she was reorganizing the dry goods storage, and the board shifted under her hand. It was a thin ledger, brown-covered, and it was not in Caleb's handwriting. She brought it to him after supper that evening, setting it on the table in front of him without preamble. "Do you know what this is?" He picked it up, looked at the cover, opened the first page. His jaw went tight. "Where did you find this?" "Behind a loose board in the pantry." She sat down across from him. "It's not your writing." "No, it's not." He turned a page. Then another. The tight line of his jaw got tighter. "This is Gibbs's handwriting. I thought it might be." She laced her fingers together on the table. "Can you tell me what it means?" He was quiet for a long moment, turning pages. "It's a supply record," he said finally. "A second supply record. A separate one from what's in the main books." He closed the ledger and set it down and looked at it with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite betrayal, but something that combined parts of both into something harder to name. He was billing me for 2 deliveries and recording 1. Keeping the difference. The silence between them was the kind that follows something you suspected but didn't want confirmed. "How long?" she asked. He checked the dates at the front and back. 14 months. She did the calculation without reaching for a pen. "At the rate I can see in these pages, that's somewhere between $200 and $250. He put both hands flat on the table. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Caleb." She used his first name for the first time without appearing to notice she'd done it, which told him something. "That money is gone. You won't get it back, not in a way that doesn't cost you more than it's worth in time and legal trouble. But knowing where it went means you know your real numbers now. And your real numbers are better than the ones you thought you had." He looked at her. "How is $250 stolen from me a better situation than what I thought I had?" "Because what you thought you had was a ranch losing money due to some combination of bad luck and mismanagement with no clear source. What you actually have is a ranch that was being systematically robbed by one man over 14 months, and that man is no longer here." She held his gaze. "The bleeding stopped when you fired him. You just didn't know the wound existed until now." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he pushed back from the table and stood and walked to the window and stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the dark. She waited. She was good at waiting. "There was a reason I didn't look at the books more carefully," he said finally. "I know." He turned around. "Do you? You were afraid of what you'd find." She said it quietly and without judgment. "A man can know his ranch is struggling and still function, as long as he doesn't have exact numbers. Once you have exact numbers, you have to decide what to do about them. And sometimes not knowing feels safer." He was quiet. "That's not a quality I'm proud of. It's a human quality," she said. "I've seen it in better men than you think you are." Something about that landed differently than he expected, not as an insult, but as a strange kind of reassurance. She wasn't flattering him. She never flattered anyone. But she was telling him she'd seen enough of the world to know that struggling with this particular thing didn't make him a lesser man, and coming from Margaret Holloway, who chose her words with the same precision she applied to everything else, that meant something. He came back to the table and sat down. "All right," he said. "What do I do with this?" "You let me finish the audit," she said. "Give me 2 more days with the full accounts, and I'll have a complete picture for you." Not a guess. A picture. And then we figure out what's actually fixable and we fix it. He nodded slowly. 2 more days, she agreed. She had the full report done in a day and a half. He read it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning before the hands were up, and when he was done he sat with it in front of him for a long time, and he thought about what she'd said about exact numbers being harder than not knowing. She'd been right about that. The numbers in her report were precise and unflinching, and required him to look at his situation with a clarity that wasn't comfortable. But underneath the discomfort was something he hadn't expected, something that felt almost like solid ground. Like he finally knew exactly where he was standing, even if where he was standing was harder than he'd told himself. He was not ruined. He was not close to ruined. He was in genuine trouble, yes, and the loan was a problem that needed to be addressed within the next 6 months, but the core of the ranch was sound. Margaret had laid it out in her clean handwriting, with the plainness of someone delivering useful information, rather than a verdict, and what the information said was, "This can be salvaged." She was in the kitchen when he came to find her, starting the morning preparations with her back to the door. He said her name and she turned and looked at him, and he held up her report. "This is the most useful document anyone has ever put in front of me," he said. "In 20 years of running this ranch." She turned back to the stove. "Then we use it. We're already using it," he said. And he meant that in more ways than he said out loud. The second week brought its first real test. It started with Garrett. Garrett was 22 and had the kind of confidence that comes from a young man who has been told often enough that he's smart and hasn't yet accumulated enough experience to know the limits of it. He had a quick mouth and a quicker judgment, and his opinion of Margaret hadn't changed as openly as some of the other men's had. Though he'd eaten her cooking every day for 10 days, with the wordless appreciation of someone who knows better than to spit on something good. What changed things was the conversation she wasn't supposed to overhear. She was in the supply room off the kitchen when Garrett came in through the back with Danny Walsh, talking in the low voices of men who think they're alone. She heard her name first, and then she stayed still. "All I'm saying," Garrett was saying, "is that she found some numbers in a ledger." "Fine, good. But that don't make her the one running things around here." "Nobody said she's running things," Danny said. "Nobody has to say it." "You seen how Caleb looks at her reports? You seen how he asks her before he decides anything now?" A pause, something being set down on the work table. "I've been on ranches where the women come in, and within 6 months the whole operation shifts to whatever she thinks it should be. Men end up working for a woman without anyone ever deciding that was how it was going to go." Danny was quiet for a moment. Then he said she did find $250 Gibbs stole Garrett. She found a ledger. She found a ledger because she reorganized the pantry at midnight, after a 3-day train journey, Danny said, and there was something in his voice that was different from the young man who had laughed on the day she'd arrived. "That ain't nothing." Garrett made a sound that was somewhere between dismissal and discomfort. Margaret picked up the bag of flour she'd come for and walked into the kitchen, and both men turned around fast. Danny's ears went red from the top down. Garrett held his ground better, but she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, how much she'd heard, what she was going to do with it. She set the flour on the work table and looked at Garrett steadily. "You worried about your position here?" A beat. He decided to meet her directly. "I'm worried about how things are changing." "What things specifically?" "The way things get decided now," he said. "The way Caleb checks with you before he does anything." "He checks with me about the accounts in the household," she said. "Same as he'd check with a foreman about cattle. Is that what concerns you?" "You ain't a foreman, no," she agreed. "I'm the person who found 14 months of theft that nobody else caught, and who has cut the operating costs of this household by $63 in 9 days. And who is currently working on getting your supply line reorganized so you stop overpaying for feed." She let that sit for a moment. "You've been on this ranch how long?" 8 months. "In 8 months did you find the ledger?" His jaw tightened. "That ain't fair. I'm not trying to embarrass you," she said, and she meant it, and he could hear that she meant it, which somehow made it worse. "I'm trying to be clear with you about what I'm here to do. I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here to keep this ranch solvent, so that when spring comes and Caleb needs to expand the herd, the money is there to do it." She picked up her flour. "Whether or not you believe that's what I'm doing doesn't change that it's what I'm doing." She went back to her bread. Garrett stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than was comfortable for either of them, and then he went out. Danny Walsh lingered by the door and said quietly, "Ma'am, I'm sorry about what I said." That first day, she looked at him over her shoulder. He was 20 years old and his ears were still red, and he meant it completely. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last," she said. "What matters is what you do after." He nodded and went out, and she went back to her bread, and the flour went into the bowl, and the morning moved on. The first visit from Nathaniel Crow came that same week. She didn't know who he was when he rode up. She was in the yard with the weekly supply inventory when the sound of hooves made her look up, and she saw a man on a horse that cost more than most men in this county made in a year, riding with the deliberate ease of someone who wants you to notice both the horse and the ease. He was somewhere in his 50s, heavy-set in the particular way of men who have been prosperous for long enough that prosperity has settled into their frame, with a dark coat and a hat that was newer than Caleb's and cleaner than anyone's who actually worked the land. He had a face that arranged itself into an agreeable expression the way a door arranges itself when you oil the hinges smoothly and with mechanism. He looked at her clipboard and her inventory list, and her round face flushed from the morning air, and he said, "Is Whitaker available?" "He's out with the herd," she said. "Is there something I can help you with?" The man looked her over in the flat assessing way of someone calculating the value of something they're not planning to purchase. "I'll wait," he said. "You're welcome to do that." She went back to her inventory. He didn't get down from the horse, which told her something. A man who gets down from his horse and waits on a porch is a man who respects the property he's waiting on. A man who stays mounted is a man who hasn't decided yet whether the property is worth respecting. "You're the new wife," he said. "Not a question." "I'm Margaret Whitaker," she said. She had used the name exactly once before, 3 days ago, when Roy Bendon had introduced her that way to a supply man who'd come to the ranch. She hadn't corrected it then, and she didn't correct it now, because there was something about this particular man that made precision feel like protection. He smiled. "Nathaniel Crow. I own the Crow Range east of here." She looked up from her clipboard. She knew that name. She'd seen it twice in the account books, once in connection with a boundary dispute that had been settled 3 years ago in Caleb's favor, and once in a letter she hadn't read fully because it wasn't her correspondence. But she'd seen enough to know the name, and what she'd seen had not made her more comfortable with it. "Mr. Crow," she said pleasantly. "Whitaker and I have some business to discuss," he said. "Tell him I came by." "I'll tell him." He sat there a moment long, necessary, the kind of moment that is a small assertion of dominance from a man who uses them habitually. Then he turned the expensive horse and rode out, and she watched him go and then went back to her inventory and wrote 2 things in the margin that weren't part of the count. The first was, Crow Range, Boundary Dispute 1871. The second was, does not get down from his horse. When Caleb came in for midday, she told him Crow had come by, and she watched his face go through something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger but had elements of both. "What did he want?" Caleb said. "He said he had business to discuss and he'd come back." She set her inventory down. "What's the boundary dispute from 1871? He looked at her. "How do you know about that?" "It's in the accounts." Briefly. "I didn't read the full correspondence." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. Crow wanted the north pasture. He claimed the original survey markers were placed wrong and the property line ran 50 yards further south than my deed showed. "We went to the county and settled it." He paused. He didn't accept it gracefully. "Men like that rarely do," she said. "Has he approached you since?" "Not directly." He was quiet for a moment. "There's been some talk in town about the ranch struggling. I don't know how it got started." She looked at him steadily. "Talk in town about a ranch struggling can get started deliberately by a man who wants to buy that ranch at a price the owner can't afford to refuse." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a thought arrives that you've been half thinking but not fully forming, and someone else completes it for you. "You think Crow's been spreading it," he said. "I think a man who stays on his horse in your yard and calls himself your business associate before you've invited him to is a man who has already decided how this conversation ends," she said. "I don't know what he's planning." But I'd want to know more about his recent movements and what he's been saying in town before he comes back here." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "How do you know how to think about this?" She picked up her coffee. "I grew up with a father who was cheated out of 40 acres by a neighbor who spread a story that our well had gone dry and the land was going bad. The story wasn't true, but by the time my father proved it wasn't true, the bank had already reduced his credit line and 2 buyers who'd been interested in a different deal had walked away." She set the cup down. "I know what a man who uses information like a weapon looks like. He looks exactly like Nathaniel Crowe." He stared at her. It was not the first time he'd stared at her in the 2 weeks she'd been here. But it was the first time he'd stared at her, the way a man stares at someone who has just shown him a map of country he thought he knew, and revealed that it was larger than he'd imagined. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want you to go to town tomorrow," she said. "Quietly, not for business. Just go to the feed store, have a coffee, listen. Find out what people are saying about this ranch and who they heard it from. And if it's Crow, then we know what we're dealing with," she said. "And we can start dealing with it." He went to town the next morning. He was back by noon. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table and didn't say anything right away, and she waited, and after a moment he said, "Jim Hasley at the feed store told me he'd heard from a man over at the Brixton Hotel that Caleb Whitaker was likely to have to sell before winter on account of his debts being worse than people thought." She was still. "Jim Hasley," he said, "drinks coffee every morning with the lawyer who handles Crow's property transactions." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she was not angry, exactly. She was the way a person is when they have confirmed a thing they were hoping they'd been wrong about. "He's already started," she said. "Appears so. Then we have less time than I thought." She stood and went to the shelving, where she kept her working files. She'd organized a separate set of folders in her first week, labeled and arranged by category in a system that was immediately legible to anyone who knew how to look. She pulled one and came back to the table. "The loan. The one from last spring. Who holds it? First Territorial Bank. Officer named Marsh. Have you met Marsh personally?" "Twice. He was decent enough." "Is he the kind of man who makes his own decisions or the kind of man who makes decisions based on what he hears?" She was looking at the folder. Caleb considered it honestly. "The second kind, I think." "Then we go to see him before Crow does." She looked up. "We go with your numbers. Your real numbers, the ones I put together last week. Not what the rumors say, and not what things looked like 2 months ago, what they actually are right now, with the costs down and the waste eliminated and the supply chain reorganized." She put her hand flat on the folder. "Caleb, your ranch is not in the condition people are being told it's in. We can prove that. But we have to prove it to the right people before the story gets there first." He was looking at her hand on the folder. Then he looked at her face. "You'd come to the bank with me? If you want me there, yes." "Margaret." He said her name carefully. "You've been here 2 weeks. I know how long I've been here. What you've done in 2 weeks." He stopped. Started again. "The other night at the feed store counter, I heard 2 men talking about Whitaker Ranch. They weren't saying what Hasley said. They were saying that whoever Whitaker brought in to run his household had turned things around fast, and it might not be as bad a bet as people thought." She was very still. "2 weeks," he said. "You've been here 2 weeks, and people in town are already talking about the ranch differently." She didn't say anything. "I keep thinking about that first night," he said. "The count books. 5 in the morning and you were already in the kitchen. Roy staying," he paused. "Even Garrett is different." "Garrett is fine," she said. "He just needed to understand what I'm here for." "What are you here for, Margaret?" She met his gaze. It was a genuine question asked with a genuine seriousness, and she answered it the same way. "I'm here because I needed somewhere to be that needed what I have. And what I have is a working knowledge of how to keep things from falling apart." She paused. "This ranch was falling apart. I'm not going to let that happen if I can stop it. Even if nobody thanks you for it. Nobody needed to thank me. The work is the work." He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to thank you anyway," he said, "when this is over. When we've dealt with Crow and the bank and whatever else is coming, I'm going to find a way to thank you that means something." She looked at him for a moment that was longer than either of them named. Then she looked back at her folder. "Right now what means something is getting to that bank before the story does. Can you arrange an appointment with Marsh for the day after tomorrow?" "I can try," she said. "Do it today." He did it today. But what he didn't know yet, what neither of them knew yet, was that Nathaniel Crow had already had his conversation with Marsh. 3 days earlier, over whiskey at the Brixton Hotel, Crow had sat across from the bank officer who held Caleb Whitaker's loan, and he had said, with the smooth certainty of a man who has done this before and expects to do it again, that it might be time for the bank to consider calling in that note early. And Marsh, who was the kind of man who made decisions based on what he heard, had listened. By the time Margaret and Caleb walked into First Territorial Bank 2 days later, they were not walking into a meeting. They were walking into a verdict that had already been decided. They just didn't know it yet. And what happened in that office in the next 40 minutes was going to change the shape of everything that came after, not because of what Marsh said, but because of what Margaret Holloway did when she understood, in the first 4 minutes of that meeting, exactly what kind of room she had walked into. The bank smelled like cold leather and old paper, and the particular kind of silence that institutions use to remind you of their power. Margaret walked through the door of First Territorial Bank with Caleb's report folder under her arm and her back straight and her face showing nothing that she didn't intend to show. She had worn her better dress, not the blue one, but a dark green wool she'd kept carefully folded at the bottom of her bag for occasions that required it. She had pinned her hair up neatly. She had done these things not because she thought they would change the outcome, but because she understood that presentation was a form of argument, and she intended to make every argument available to her. The clerk at the front desk looked at them with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned to be courteous to all manner of people without being welcoming to any of them. He sent them to wait on a wooden bench against the wall while he went to inform Mr. Marsh of their arrival. Caleb sat beside her. He had his hat in his hands and he was turning it by the brim, slowly the way Roy Bendon had turned his hat in the kitchen doorway the morning he decided to stay. She recognized the gesture. Now it was what these men did when they were trying to hold something still inside themselves. "You've done this before," he said quietly. "Walked into a room like this." "Not this room," she said. "Anne?" "And the room always thinks it already knows how the conversation ends." She shifted the folder in her hands. "The trick is to make the room wrong before it realizes what happened." He looked at her sideways. "That's either very reassuring or very frightening." "Both, probably," she said. And then the clerk came back and led them down a short hallway to a door at the end, and there was no more time for either of them to be frightened. Marsh was a man in his late 50s with the kind of careful grooming that signals a person who wants to be taken seriously in a context where he isn't always sure he will be. He had thinning hair and a good suit and hands that hadn't seen outdoor work in a long time, and he stood when they came in and shook Caleb's hand with the warmth of someone who has already decided on a course of action and feels guilty about it. That was the thing Margaret saw in the first 4 seconds. The guilt. A man who has good news for you doesn't feel guilty when you walk in. A man who has bad news that he's been told to deliver feels guilty when you walk in. Marsh had the face of a man who had been talked into something and had agreed to it and was now sitting across from the person it was going to hurt, and the guilt of that was right there on the surface if you knew where to look. She knew where to look. "Mr. Whitaker," Marsh said, settling back into his chair. "Good of you to come in. I was going to send a letter this week, actually." "A letter about what?" Caleb said. Marsh folded his hands on the desk. "The bank has been reviewing its current loan portfolio. Given the economic conditions in the county this year, we've been making some assessments about risk and exposure." He paused in the way people pause when they're choosing words that will soften something that cannot be softened. "There's been some concern raised about several of the agricultural loans we extended in the spring. Yours among them." Caleb went very still. "The terms of my loan don't come due for another 7 months. That's correct, Marsh said. However, the bank does have provisions for early review in cases where... Mr. Marsh, Margaret set the folder on the desk. Marsh looked at her. He had been looking at Caleb, the way men in rooms like this look at the man when a man and a woman enter together, and her speaking directly to him recalibrated something in his expression. I'm Margaret Whitaker, she said. I manage the household accounts at Whitaker Ranch. I've been in that position for the past 18 days. She opened the folder. I'd like you to look at these numbers before we discuss early review provisions. He looked at the folder, then at her. Mrs. Whitaker, this is a financial matter between the bank. These are the ranch's financial records, she said, and she did not raise her voice and she did not drop it. She kept it at exactly the level she'd chosen, current as of 3 days ago. I think they're relevant to any conversation about the bank's assessment of risk and exposure. She turned the first page toward him. I'll walk you through them if that's helpful. A beat. The guilt on Marsh's face had been joined by something else now, a calculation, the kind that happens when a man realizes the room is going somewhere he didn't prepare for. The ranch's operating costs have been reduced by $63 per month since I took over the accounts, she said. The reduction comes from 3 sources: elimination of duplicate supply orders that were being processed without oversight, renegotiation of 2 supplier relationships that were running at above market rates, and correction of a kitchen expenditure that was running 60% over reasonable cost for a household of this size due to waste and theft. Marsh's eyebrows moved. Theft, she'd confirmed. We have the documentation. I won't bore you with it unless it's relevant, but the point is that the losses that made this ranch look like a poor credit risk were not structural losses. They were a product of mismanagement that has been corrected. She turned another page. Current monthly operating costs are here. Projected costs through winter are here, accounting for seasonal adjustments. Revenue projections based on current herd numbers and spring market rates are here. She tapped each column as she named it. The loan is serviceable. It was serviceable before I arrived, and it is more serviceable now. Marsh looked at the pages. He was reading them, actually reading them, not performing reading, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. These projections, he said carefully, assume the herd numbers hold through winter. They assume a 5% loss through winter, which is the county average for the past 4 years, she said. I pulled those figures from the agricultural survey published by the county extension office last November. If you have different figures, I'd want to see them. He didn't have different figures, Mr. Marsh, Caleb said. He had been quiet through all of this, and when he spoke his voice was steady, in a way that it might not have been if he'd walked in here alone. I've been a customer of this bank for 11 years. I've made every payment on time, and I have never asked for an adjustment or an extension. I'm asking you now to look at those numbers and tell me whether the concern that prompted this meeting was based on information about my actual ranch or on something someone told you about it. The word someone landed in the room like a stone into still water. Marsh straightened in his chair. The bank makes its own assessments. The bank makes its assessments based on information, Caleb said. I'm asking where the information came from. A silence. Marsh looked at his own hands. Because if the information came from Nathaniel Crow, Caleb said, I think you should know that Crow has had a documented interest in acquiring my north pasture going back to a boundary dispute he lost in 1871. And a man who wants to buy land at a distressed price has a clear interest in the land appearing more distressed than it is. The silence that followed was the loudest silence in that room since they'd walked in. Marsh said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the folder. Then he looked at Caleb. Then, briefly, he looked at Margaret in a way that was different from the first way he'd looked at her. Not the dismissing look of a man who hadn't decided whether she was worth listening to, but the look of a man who had arrived at a conclusion about her that he was still adjusting to. I'm going to need to review these figures with our senior officer, he said finally. Of course, Margaret said. He blinked. It may take some time. We have time, she said. They waited 40 minutes. She sat with her hands in her lap, and Caleb sat beside her and turned his hat and didn't speak much, and she didn't speak much either. And the silence between them was not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that exists between two people who are in something together and don't need to fill the air to make that real. At one point he said very quietly, "The way you talk to him." Was it too much? No, it was exactly right. I didn't know anyone could do that. Do what? Walk into a room that's already decided against you and make it undecide, he said. She looked at her hands. The room hadn't fully decided. If it had fully decided, Marsh would have sent the letter instead of agreeing to a meeting. There was still a door open. You just have to know how to find it. And if there hadn't been a door, she thought about it. Then we'd have found a window. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, quiet and real, and she felt something warm move through her chest that she told herself was just relief about the meeting. Marsh came back with his senior officer, a man named Colton, who was older and sharper-eyed, and had the look of someone who had made assessments of people's situations for long enough that he could do it faster than most people realized. He sat down, looked at the folder Margaret had left on the desk, asked 3 precise questions about the supply renegotiation, and then sat back and said, "The loan stands on its current terms." Just like that, Marsh had the grace to look relieved. Margaret had the discipline not to let her own relief show. Walking out of the bank into the midday air, Caleb stopped on the step and stood for a moment. She came to stand beside him, and they were both quiet, and then he said, "You just saved my ranch." "We're not finished saving your ranch," she said. "No," he agreed. But that was the part that was going to finish it if we'd lost. He turned to look at her. "Margaret." She looked back at him. "I don't have words," for he stopped. "You don't need words," she said. "Let's go home." They drove back in a silence that was entirely different from the silence of the drive to town, and neither of them tried to make it into something it wasn't, and that was exactly right. The trouble was Nathaniel Crow found out about the meeting by supper time. She didn't know how the county had ears that worked faster than telegraph wire when it suited certain people, but by the time Roy came in from the late afternoon check on the north fence, he'd heard it in passing. From a rider who'd come up from the Brixton direction. Crow knew the bank had not called the loan, and Crow was not the kind of man who lost a move gracefully. Roy told Caleb in the yard, and Caleb came inside with a look on his face that Margaret read in an instant. She was at the stove, and she turned and saw him and said, "What happened?" "Crow knows." She set down her spoon. "How soon do you think he moves again?" "Roy thinks within the week." He sat down at the table. "A man like Crow doesn't have just approach." "No," she agreed, "he doesn't." She came and sat across from him. "Tell me everything you know about his operation, not the boundary dispute." "Everything. Who works for him, who his lawyer is, what land he holds, and in what order he acquired it." Caleb talked. She listened and wrote, and the list that accumulated under her pen was longer than he'd expected to have in his head about a neighbor he'd been trying not to think too much about. When he was done, she looked at what she'd written and was quiet for a moment. "His lawyer," she said, "Aldous Webb. He was the one who handled the boundary dispute." "Yes, is Webb an honest man?" Caleb considered it. "I think Webb does what he's paid to do. He's not a man I'd call dishonest, but he's not a man with scruples that get in the way of his client's interests. But he's a man with a reputation to protect," she said. "I suppose so. A man with a reputation to protect can be reasoned with," she said. "A man with no reputation doesn't care what you show him." "But Webb has been in this county how long? 20 years at least." "Then he cares about his standing here." She tapped her pen on the paper. "Whatever Crow's next move is, it'll go through Webb. And whatever goes through Webb has to be something Webb can present as legally legitimate. That's Crow's constraint. He's not a man who does things in the open, he does them through channels that look proper. Which means he needs paper." She looked up. "Do you have a complete record of your property deed and all associated water rights filings?" "At the ranch. In my office. I need to see them tonight." "Margaret, tonight," she said. Not urgently, but with the quiet firmness of someone who has done the calculation and arrived at a number that doesn't allow for delay. He showed her the deed that night, and what she found was what she'd half expected to find and half prayed she wouldn't. The water rights filing associated with the North Pasture, the same North Pasture Crow had tried to claim in 1871, had a clerical error in the registration number. Not an error that changed the meaning of the document or invalidated the filing. A minor transcription error, the kind that happens when a county clerk is copying numbers from one ledger to another and transposes 2 digits. Caleb hadn't known it was there. There was reason he should have known it was there. But a man with a lawyer who had been looking at that filing for 3 years, waiting for something he could use, that man might know it was there. She set the document on the table and put her finger on the number. "There," she said. Caleb leaned in. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "That's wrong." "It's wrong," she agreed. And wrong registration numbers on water rights filings can be used to argue that the filing is invalid. Which would mean the water rights revert to county determination, he said. Which means whoever makes the strongest claim. And whoever makes the strongest claim, she said, is whoever has the best relationship with the county recorder. She looked at him. Who is the county recorder? The name that came out of Caleb's mouth made her close her eyes briefly. The county recorder was a man named Harold Finch. Harold Finch had worked for Nathaniel Crow for 4 years before taking the county position. Harold Finch had been recommended for the county position by Nathaniel Crow's lawyer. She opened her eyes. How long has Finch been county recorder? 2 years, and the error in this filing, when was it made? Caleb checked the date, 18 months ago, when the registry was transferred to the new format. She sat back. The picture was complete now, and she sat with it the way you sit with something that is both clarifying and terrible grateful to know, and wishing you didn't have to. He's been setting this up for 18 months, she said. Using a county official, Caleb said. His voice was flat in the way of a man who is keeping anger on a leash by sheer effort of will. Possibly. Or Finch made the error and Crow found out about it and decided to use it. Either way, the result is the same. She pulled the deed toward her. We need to correct this filing before he acts on it. We need to get to the county seat with documentation of the original correct number and file a correction notice. The county seat is a day's ride. Then someone goes tomorrow. Who? You should go. It needs to be the property owner. But she paused. You need someone with you who knows what documentation to bring and how to talk to a records clerk. Are you suggesting yourself? I'm suggesting Roy, she said. Roy's been here 9 years. He knows the ranch's history with that land. He can speak to it if anyone asks questions. She paused. I'll write out exactly what to say and what to ask for. Roy is a man people trust when they see him. He has that quality. Caleb nodded slowly. And if Finch is already there when we arrive? Then you're filing a routine correction notice, which is a legal right of any property owner, and Finch has no grounds to refuse to process it. She met his gaze. He'll know what you're doing, but knowing isn't the same as being able to stop it. They sat across from each other in the lamplight, and the weight of what they were dealing with sat between them like a third presence at the table, heavy and real, and requiring to be addressed. He's not going to stop after this, Caleb said. No, she agreed. He's not. What does he do next? She thought about it carefully before she answered. He applies pressure somewhere you can't reach with paperwork. Something personal. Something that makes you want to give up not because you have to, but because continuing costs more than you think you can pay. She looked at her hands. That's how men like Crow work. They don't beat you in a fair fight. They make the fight so exhausting that you stop fighting. The quiet that followed had a different quality than the other quiet moments between them. This one carried something that hadn't been present before, a recognition, mutual and unspoken, that what was ahead of them was harder than what was behind them, and that neither of them was going to be able to handle it alone. It was Caleb who spoke first. When I was 23, he said, I came to Montana with $112, a horse, and the absolute certainty that I could build something here if I worked hard enough. He was looking at the deed on the table. I built it. It took everything I had for 20 years, every decision I made, every dollar I didn't spend on something easier. And then I watched it start to come apart and I didn't know how to stop it. He paused. I hired you because I needed someone to cook and keep the books. I want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was about what I was asking for. She didn't say anything right away. I don't mean wrong about hiring you, he said quickly. I mean wrong about the size of it, about what it would be. I put an advertisement in a paper and asked for a housekeeper, and what arrived was he stopped and looked at her. I don't have the right word. You don't need a word, she said. But her voice was quieter than usual when she said it. I do, he said. I want to have the right word for it. He held her gaze. The best I can come up with is partner. The word sat between them. She looked at him for a long moment. Her face showed something that she didn't fully manage to keep contain, something that moved across her expression, the way light moves across water, present, and then not quite present, and then present again. That's a good word, she said finally. He nodded once. And then they both looked back at the deed, and the work that was still ahead of them, because that was who they were, people who felt things, and then went back to the work. Because the feeling and the work were not separate things, but the same thing, running through the same current. Roy Bendon and Caleb left for the county seat before sunrise the next morning, with Margaret's written instructions in Roy's breast pocket and the corrected documentation in a leather satchel that Caleb carried himself. She stood in the yard and watched them go, and then went inside and started breakfast for the 5 remaining hands, moving through the kitchen with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. Garrett came in at 5:30 and sat down and ate his eggs and said, without looking up from his plate, "What are they doing at the county seat?" "Filing some paperwork," she said. He looked up then. He had the instinct of a man who can tell when an understatement is hiding something significant. "What kind of paperwork?" She looked at him across the kitchen. She made a decision. "There's an error in the water rights filing for the North Pasture," she said. "It's the kind of error that could be used by a man with the right connections and the right motivation to challenge the validity of the filing. We're correcting it before that can happen." Garrett set down his fork. Crow, very likely. The silence that followed had a different quality from every other silence Garrett had produced in her presence. The calculation was still there, it was always there. In Garrett, who processed everything through the lens of what it meant for his position and his standing, but underneath the calculation now was something else. Something that looked like the moment when a man decides which side of a thing he's actually on. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "I need someone to ride the fence line on the North Pasture today and tell me if there's been anyone on or near that land recently. Footprints, horse tracks, any sign of someone looking at the survey markers." He stood up. "I'll go now." He went without finishing his breakfast. She watched him go and then turned back to the stove, and Danny Walsh, who had been eating quietly at the end of the table and had heard the entire exchange, said, "You just recruited Garrett." "Garrett recruited himself," she said. "That's the same thing in his case," Danny said. "He doesn't do anything he doesn't think he decided to do." A pause. "How do you do that? Make people think something was their idea when it was yours." She handed him the coffee pot to refill and said, "I just tell people the truth about the situation and let them figure out where they stand. What they decide genuinely their decision." Danny considered this. "That sounds simpler than it is." "Most things do," she said. Garrett came back at noon with exactly what she'd been afraid he'd find. 3 sets of fresh horse tracks along the north fence line, coming from the Crow Range side. 2 survey markers disturbed, not removed, not obviously tampered with, but shifted just enough that a careful eye could tell. And a piece of paper tucked under a rock near the 3rd marker, which Garrett had not touched, but had covered back over and come straight home to report. "What's on the paper?" she asked. "Don't know. I didn't read it." "You didn't read it," she said. "Why not?" "Because you said to look and report, not to touch anything." He met her eyes. "You said that for a reason." She had said it for exactly that reason, because anything found on that fence line could become evidence, and evidence that had been handled was less useful than evidence that had been left exactly as it was found. Garrett, who had come to her kitchen 8 days ago, asking pointed questions about her authority, had followed her instructions to the letter and understood why without being told. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Good. We don't touch it until Caleb's back. Is it bad?" Garrett said. "It's a message," she said. "And a message means Crow's impatient. Impatient men make mistakes." She turned back to the stove. "We just have to be ready when he makes one." Caleb and Roy returned at dusk, road dusty and tired, and Caleb came into the kitchen and said before he'd even sat down, "The correction notice is filed." Finch was there. He tried to tell us there was a review period required before corrections could be processed on filings from the past 2 years. Margaret looked up from the stove. "Is there?" "There is not," Caleb said with the satisfaction of a man who had done his preparation. "I had the regulation in writing." Roy read it aloud to Finch from 12 inches away. "The notice is filed and stamped, and we have the receipt." Roy, who was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, said, "Finch looked like he'd bit into something sour." "I imagine he did," she said. She set down her spoon. "Sit down, both of you. There's something else." She told them about the fence line, about the tracks and the disturbed markers, about the paper under the rock. Caleb's expression went through several things in quick succession, landing finally on something cold and resolved. Roy was still and quiet in the way of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the order. "We go to the fence at first light," Caleb said, "all of us who can be spared." "All of us," Garrett said from the doorway, where he had appeared at some point in the last minute with Danny Walsh behind him. The rest of the hands were visible behind them in the corridor, having come in from the bunkhouse without anyone summoning them. Word traveled fast among men who had started paying attention. Margaret looked at all of them. 7 men, every hand on the ranch, standing in her kitchen or in the doorway of it, waiting. She thought about Roy, who'd been thinking about leaving. She thought about Garrett, who had started by questioning her authority. She thought about Danny Walsh's red ears on that first morning. She thought about all the small shifts and adjustments of the past 3 weeks, each one adding to the next, and she understood something in that moment with a clarity that was almost physical. She had not done this, or rather she had not done this alone. She had shown up and done her work, and told the truth, and the men had done the rest themselves, because men who feel valued make different choices than men who don't. She had not built loyalty. She had given loyalty something to grow toward. Caleb was looking at her across the kitchen. He was reading her face the way he'd learned to read it in 3 weeks, and what he was reading made something quiet and certain settle in his own expression. "First light," he said to the room, everyone, and nobody said anything different. What none of them saw. Because it happened in the dark on the far side of the north pasture, while they were all inside deciding to stand together, what none of them saw was the second rider, who had come and gone an hour before Garrett's morning check, who had not stopped at the fence line or the survey markers, but had ridden straight to the eastern corner of the property and spent 20 careful minutes examining something in the ground near the creek bed. And what that rider had been examining was going to arrive in Caleb Whitaker's life the following morning, in the form of a letter stamped official, and carrying the seal of a county court that would make everything they had done at the bank and the county records office look like the small preliminary moves they were, and would force Margaret Holloway into the most consequential decision of everything she had done since she stepped off that train. The letter arrived at 7 in the morning, carried by a county rider who didn't get off his horse. He handed it down to Garrett, who was the first one in the yard, and then turned and rode back the way he came without a word. Garrett looked at the seal on the envelope and felt something go cold in his stomach. He walked it inside and set it on the kitchen table in front of Margaret, who was at the stove, and said only, "County seal." She turned and looked at it. She didn't pick it up. She said, "Get Caleb." Caleb came down in 2 minutes, still buttoning his shirt, and he saw Margaret's face first before he saw the envelope, and what he saw on her face made him stop in the doorway for just a half second before he came the rest of the way in. She was not a woman whose face showed alarm easily. What was on her face right now was not alarm, exactly, but it was the thing that exists just before alarm, when a person has identified the shape of something serious and is holding themselves steady while they assess it. He picked up the envelope, opened it. Read it standing at the table, and she watched his face go through the same kind of change she'd seen it go through, in the tight jaw, the careful stillness, but this time there was something underneath the stillness that was rawer. Something that took him a moment longer to contain. He set the letter on the table, and she picked it up. It was a legal notice from the county court, filed on behalf of Nathaniel Crow, claiming a disputed easement right across the eastern portion of Whitaker Ranch property, specifically the creek bed at the eastern corner, based on a decades-old grazing arrangement that Crow alleged had constituted common use of the water. Source for a period sufficient to establish legal easement rights under territorial law. She read the second time, slower. "This is Webb's work," she said. "Yes, and the writer yesterday, the one we didn't see checking the creek bed. He was documenting the physical layout for the filing." "Has to be." She set the letter down. "How old is this grazing arrangement he's claiming?" "There was a period," Caleb said carefully, "in the early years before I had the east fence fully finished, when cattle from the Crow Range did use the creek occasionally. It was before any formal boundary was established." He paused. "I didn't think it was anything. It was 2, maybe 3 seasons at most, and it stopped when the fence went up." "How long ago?" 15 years. "And you have no written record of that period?" It wasn't a question. She already knew the answer by his face. "No," he said. She sat down. She put both hands flat on the table, and she looked at them, and she thought, with the precise and focused clarity that she brought to every problem that mattered, about what she was looking at. The easement claim, if it succeeded, would give Crow legal right of access across the eastern corner of the ranch. The creek bed ran along that corner for a quarter mile before it bent north. Controlling the creek meant controlling the water supply for the east pasture. Controlling the east pasture meant the cattle couldn't graze there without Crow's interference. And the east pasture was where Caleb ran his best breeding stock. It wasn't a claim designed to take the ranch outright. It was a claim designed to make the ranch unworkable from the inside. A slow strangulation, elegant in the way that genuinely malicious plans are sometimes elegant. It required almost nothing from Crow except patience and a lawyer who knew which century-old territorial statutes to cite. Roy appeared in the kitchen doorway. Then Garrett. Then Danny Walsh. They had been listening from the hall in the way the ranch hands had taken to positioning themselves when something important was happening in the kitchen, and none of them pretended otherwise anymore. "How," Roy said. Caleb looked at him. "Bad enough." "What does he get if it goes through?" "Access to the creek bed on the east corner. Right of way across the eastern property line." Caleb paused. "Control of the water supply for the east pasture." Roy's face went through something that she recognized as the expression of a man who has been on this land long enough to understand exactly what that means in practical terms. He said a word under his breath that was not suitable for mixed company, and then pulled out a chair and sat down. "What do we do?" Danny said. Everyone looked at Margaret. She was still looking at her hands on the table. She was running the problem through every angle she had, the way she ran every problem, not searching for the answer she wanted, but for the answer that was actually there. And what she was finding as she turned it over was that this problem had a different shape from the bank problem and the water rights problem. Those problems had been solvable with documents and correct information and a room full of the right people. This problem required something she didn't have. "I need to understand the easement law," she said. "The specific territorial statute he's citing. I need the actual text." "Where do you get that?" Garrett said. "The county law library," she said. "Or a lawyer who isn't Aldous Webb." Caleb said, "The only other lawyer in the county I'd trust is William Shart. He's in Briar Falls. Half a day's ride." She looked at the letter again. The filing date gave them 14 days to respond. Go today, she said. Take the letter. Take copies of the deed, the water rights filing, the correction notice receipt, and the account records. She paused. And take this. She stood and went to her folder on the shelf and pulled a single page and set it on the table. It was a timeline she had written 3 days ago, when she'd first understood the shape of what Crow was doing, every event, every move, with dates in the order they had happened, showing clearly the pattern of coordinated action. Caleb picked it up and read it. His expression changed. You mapped this out. 3 days ago, she said. I didn't have the creek bed piece yet, now I do. She pointed to the bottom of the page. Add today's date and the easement filing. The pattern is complete. He looked at her over the top of the page. You knew he was going to do something like this. I knew he wasn't finished, she said. The bank move and the water rights challenge were setup moves. A man like Crow doesn't expose himself that way unless he's building to something. I didn't know what the something was going to be. Now we know. And this timeline, this helps Shard. It shows a judge, if it comes to that this is not an isolated easement dispute. It's a coordinated campaign of legal harassment designed to force a sale. She held his gaze. That's a different legal situation than a standard property dispute. And it's one that Webb would rather not have argued in open court. The kitchen was very quiet. Danny Walsh said, from his spot by the wall, she just turned his whole plan around on him. Not yet, she said. We've identified what to do. Doing it is the next part. Caleb was already moving. He had the letter and the folder in his hand, and he was calling to Roy about saddling 2 horses, and the kitchen went from still to moving in the space of 30 seconds, in the way it always did when Caleb made a decision and put himself behind it. She watched him go and felt the same thing she always felt in those moments, the particular satisfaction of seeing a capable man operate at full capacity, which was something she had not seen enough of in her life. Garrett stayed behind. He stood in the kitchen after the others went out, and he said, What do we do while they're gone? You ride the east fence, she said. Take Danny. I want to know if there's anyone on or near that creek bed. Don't approach anyone you find there. Come back and tell me. And if they're setting up markers? Survey stakes? Photograph the position of everything with your memory, she said. Exact touch anything. Evidence has to stay where it is. He nodded and went. She turned back to the stove and started the morning preparations, and the ranch moved around her in its familiar rhythms. And she worked and she thought, and the thinking and the working were the same motion, as they always were. The thing she hadn't said, the thing she was holding carefully in the front of her mind and examining with the same precise attention she gave to all the dangerous things, was the question of whether Shard could help them in time. 14 days was not nothing, but Webb had been building this for months, and he knew the statutes better than anyone who was coming to them fresh. And the territorial easement law was old and poorly codified and full of the kind of ambiguity that a skilled lawyer could use in either direction. She didn't let herself think too far past that. She did what she always did with the things she couldn't control. She set them on a shelf in her mind and turned to the things she could. What she could do was cook. What she could do was keep the accounts. What she could do was keep the men steady and the household running and the work of the ranch moving forward the way it needed to move forward, because a ranch that stops working stops being worth fighting for. She cooked. She kept the accounts. The men ate and went out to work and came back and ate again, and the ranch moved through the day in the way it had been moving through days since she'd arrived, which was to say with a purpose and an energy it hadn't had before her. At midday, Garrett and Danny came back from the east fence. Garrett's face, when he came through the kitchen door, told her everything before he said a word. How many steaks, she said, stopped. You knew. I suspected. How many? 4, he said. Red cloth tied on each one, marking a line from the south edge of the creek bend to the northeast corner. He paused. They weren't there 3 days ago. I rode that fence line myself. They put them in last night, she said, after the letter was delivered. They're establishing the visual record to support the filing. She set down her spoon. Did anyone see you? No, we stayed back like you said. Good. She was already thinking, we need a record of our own. Someone who can ride out there today and document the current state of the property from our side. Not a lawyer. Someone the county knows and trusts. The pastor? Danny offered. She shook her head. Someone with legal standing to testify to what they observed, she thought. Is there a county surveyor? Someone independent? Garrett said slowly, there's a man named Aldrich who does survey work out of Briar Falls. He's done work for ranches all over this county. No connection to Crow that I know of. Can you find him today? I can try, she said, using the same words she'd used to Caleb about the bank appointment. Find him. Offer him twice his standard rate. Tell him it's urgent. Tell him you need an independent survey of the eastern property line, creek bed included, completed today and documented in writing before sundown. Garrett was already moving toward the door. He stopped and looked back at her. You know what you're doing, he said. It was not a question. There was nothing left of the challenge that had been in his voice in the early days. What was there now was something that looked, on Garrett's face, like the particular respect a man develops for someone who has earned it from him in a way he wasn't expecting. I know what I'm doing, she said. Go. He went. She was alone in the kitchen for the fikta bentidze, and she stood at the work table and she let herself for 30 seconds feel the full weight of what was happening. She gave herself 30 seconds because she had learned years ago that denying the weight of something didn't make you stronger. It just meant you were spending energy you needed for other things on the work of pretending the weight wasn't there. Better to feel it clearly for 30 seconds and then put it down and pick up the next thing. The weight was considerable. She felt it, the awareness that Crow had more resources than Caleb, more legal preparation, more time invested in this particular plan. The awareness that 14 days was not very long. The awareness that even if Shard could help them, a legal process could drag past the point where the damage to the ranch became irreversible. The awareness, underneath all of that she had brought Caleb into this fight more fully than he'd been in it before, and that if it went wrong, part of that was on her. 30 seconds, she felt it. Then she put it down and went back to work. Caleb and Roy returned after dark, later than she'd expected, and she had kept supper warm and was at the table with her papers when she heard the horses in the yard. She heard Roy's voice, and then Caleb's, and then only Caleb's boots on the steps, and she knew from the sound of them the rhythm of someone carrying news they haven't decided how to present what kind of meeting it had been. He came in and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. Shard can take the case, he said. She waited, but he says the easement claim has legs. Not strong legs, but enough. Caleb sat down across from her. The territorial statute is genuinely ambiguous. Crow's lawyer found a real piece of the law, and he's using it correctly. Shard can fight it, but he told me straight if it goes to a judge, the outcome is not certain. What does Shard think is our strongest argument? The pattern. He looked at her. Your timeline. He read it and he said that if we can demonstrate this is harassment rather than a legitimate property dispute, there's grounds to seek dismissal and potentially damages. He paused. But he needs more than the timeline. He needs either a witness who can testify to Crow's intent or evidence of coordination between Crow and Finch that goes beyond what we can currently prove. She was quiet for a moment. The supply records from Gibbs, she said. He looked at her. What about them? Gibbs stole from you for 14 months. He didn't spend that money on anything visible. He was a man who drank and didn't gamble, and 14 months of theft at the rate I calculated should have left him with money he didn't have before. She leaned forward. Where is Gibbs now? He left the county when I fired him. Last I heard he was in Billings. Who told you that? Crow's foreman mentioned it in passing, about a month before you arrived. Said he'd seen Gibbs in Billings. She sat with that for 3 full seconds. Crow's foreman, she said. Caleb heard it at the same time she said it. She watched his face change, watched the thing that had been half-formed at the back of his mind come fully into the light. Gibbs worked for me for 4 years, he said slowly. And Crow's foreman knew where he went after I fired him. A man who steals from an employer for 14 months and then disappears neatly to a city a day's ride away. And the only person in the county who seems to know where he went is connected to the man who then files a legal claim against that same employer. She held his gaze. Gibbs might have been paid to create the supply losses, to make your finances look worse than they were, so the bank pressure would be more effective. The silence that followed was the long kind. That's a serious thing to say, Caleb said. I know it is, she said. I'm not saying I can prove it. I'm saying the shape of it fits, and if we can find Gibbs and have someone talk to him, someone he might talk to, honestly, we might learn something that changes what Shard can do with this. Who would Gibbs talk to, honestly? She thought about it. Roy, she said. Roy worked alongside Gibbs for 4 years. They weren't friends, but Roy is the kind of man other men talk to. He has that quality. She paused. If Roy went to Billings and found Gibbs and just had a conversation, not threatening, not accusatory, just a conversation between men who used to work the same ranch, Gibbs might say something useful. Caleb looked at the table for a long moment. That's a lot of if. Yes, she said, it is. And if Gibbs was paid by Crow, he might warn Crow that we're looking. He might, she agreed, which is a risk. But Crow already knows we're fighting back. We're past the point where the risk of him changes very much. She met his eyes. What changes things is what we know. Right now he has more information than we do, and he's been planning longer than we have. The only way to close that gap is to go looking for the parts of the picture that are still missing. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She had learned in 4 weeks of living alongside this man that his silences were not empty. They were the sound of someone thinking carefully, which was a quality she respected more than the quick, confident answer that turned out to be wrong. All right, Roy goes to Billings, a pause. And Aldrich? She told him about Garrett finding the stakes. She told him about sending Garrett to find Aldrich. Caleb listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he said, Garrett went for you. Without me asking. Garrett went because it was the right thing to do, she said. He figured that out himself. Caleb looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. It was quieter than his other expressions, softer, though soft wasn't quite the right word. It was the expression of a man looking at something he values very much and is only now beginning to understand the full extent of what that means. Margaret, he said. She waited. I need to say something that I haven't said properly yet. He put his hands on the table, not flat this time but loosely clasped, the way a man holds his hands when he's trying to say something careful. When you walked off that train, I had a moment, I had that moment. And I apologized for it, and I meant the apology. But I want to say something more than that. She was very still. I've watched you for 4 weeks, he said. I've watched you walk into every hard thing this ranch has thrown at you and handle it without ever once making it about yourself. Without ever asking for credit. Without ever, he paused. I had the same thought everyone had when I saw you on that platform. And then within 2 hours you were sitting at my kitchen table finding money I didn't know I'd lost, and within a week you'd changed the way my men felt about coming to work. And within a month you are the reason my ranch is still standing against a man who's been trying to take it for 15 years. He held her gaze. The person who walked off that train is not who I thought I was getting. She is considerably more. She looked at him for a long moment. Something was moving across her face that she was not quite managing to keep contained, and she was not sure she was trying as hard to contain it as she usually did. She said. I know, he said. I know the arrangement. I know what we agreed to. I'm not asking you to change anything tonight. I just wanted you to know that I see you. Clearly. All of it. And what I see is the most remarkable person I have ever shared a roof with, and I didn't want another day to go by without saying that out loud. The lamp between them burned steady. She said, when I got on that train in Pennsylvania, I told myself this was a practical arrangement, and I was going to treat it like one. That I wasn't going to want more from it than what it was. She looked at the lamp. I have not been entirely successful at that. The silence that followed was the warmest kind. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't make it into something it wasn't ready to be. He just sat with what she'd said and let it be what it was, an admission, freely made. by a woman who didn't make admissions casually, and the careful way he received it told her something about him that she added to everything else she already knew. "Then we don't need to decide anything tonight," he said. "No," she agreed, "don't. We've got enough on our plate as it is." Something that was almost a laugh moved through her. "We do." He stood and she stood, and he said goodnight, and she said goodnight, and they went to their separate rooms, and the distance between those rooms was the same distance it had been for 4 weeks, and yet it felt entirely different from both directions. Aldrich arrived at the ranch the next morning before Garrett had to go looking for him a second time. He was a lean, precise man in his 60s who carried his equipment with the care of someone who understood exactly what his work was worth. And he listened to what Garrett told him on the way out and asked 3 sharp, clarifying questions and then went to work without any further discussion. He was at the creek bed for 2 hours. He came back with a written survey document that established the current position of every stake, every marker, and every natural boundary point on the eastern property line, all dated and timed and signed with his professional seal. He handed it to Margaret, who had come out to the yard when she heard him return. "Those stakes," he said without preamble, "were placed within the last 48 hours. I can tell by the ground disturbance around the base of each one." He paused. "Also, 2 of them are placed outside the line that a legitimate easement based on the creekbed access would establish. They're staked approximately 12 yards further north than the creek bend actually runs." She looked at him. "They're claiming more than the creek." "If those stakes were used as evidence of the historical use boundary, yes. They'd be claiming more than they could legally claim, even if the easement itself were valid." He held her gaze with the directness of a man who has been doing careful work for a long time and knows what careless work looks like when he sees it. "Someone placed those stakes in a hurry, or without proper survey knowledge, or with the deliberate intention of overclaiming." "Or all 3, he agreed. She took the document and held it the way she held documents she knew mattered, not loosely, not carelessly, but with both hands and a conscious awareness of what it was. "Mr. Aldrich, I may need you to testify to these findings before a judge." "I'm aware," he said. "That's why I signed and sealed it." He picked up his equipment bag. "Mrs. Whitaker, whoever staked that line was counting on no one looking carefully. I'd recommend looking carefully at everything else they've filed." He left. She went inside and added Aldrich's document to the folder and sent a rider to Shard's office in Briar Falls that afternoon. Roy left for Billings the following morning. He took 3 days of provisions and the name of the boarding house in Billings, where Crow's foreman had placed Gibbs, which Margaret had extracted from a casual conversation with 2 of the other hands who remembered the original mention more clearly than they'd realized. Roy went without fanfare, which was exactly his way, and the ranch absorbed his absence and kept moving. The week that followed was the quietest and the most tense week Margaret had spent since she'd arrived. The legal machinery was in motion, and she had done everything she could do to set it in motion correctly, and now the thing she had least practice with, waiting, was what was required. She cooked, she kept the accounts. She made a second set of copies of every document in the folder, and hid them in 2 separate locations in the house, because she was a woman who had learned that important things should not exist in only one place. She kept the men's spirits from flagging through the particular combination of good food and honest straight talk that she'd found, worked on all of them, each in slightly different proportions. Garrett had become something she hadn't entirely anticipated, useful in a way that went beyond riding fence lines. He had a sharp eye and a quick mind, and now that decided to use them for her, instead of against her, the results were considerable. He started bringing her information, things he heard in town, when he went for supplies, things the other hands mentioned, patterns he noticed that he thought she'd want to know about. He brought them without being asked, and delivered them without drama, and she used what was useful and filed the rest, and neither of them made a production of what this had become. It was Garrett who told her on the 5th day that Aldous Webb had been seen riding toward the bank in town. She was at the kitchen table when he told her. She set down her pen. "Which bank?" "First Territorial." She was quiet for a moment. "Late morning." Around 10, she stood and went to the shelf where she kept the folder. She pulled Marsh's business card, which she had taken from his desk during their meeting, with the practiced invisibility of a woman who picks up useful things without drawing attention to the fact. She looked at it for a moment. "I need to go to town," she said. Garrett looked at her. Now, she was already untying her apron. "Can you drive me?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. She was in the wagon and moving within 10 minutes. She had the folder with her, specifically the Aldrich survey document and the timeline. She also had in her coat pocket a letter she had written 2 days earlier, and not yet sent, a letter addressed to the county district judge, laying out in precise and documented detail the sequence of events from Crow's first visit to the ranch through the easement filing, with every date, every document number, and every piece of corroborating evidence attached. She had written it as a precaution. She was now thinking it might need to be more than a precaution. She found Marsh leaving the bank at 11:15. He was on the step pulling on his gloves when he saw her coming, and something moved across his face, not guilt this time, but its cousin, the expression of a man caught between two difficult things. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Marsh." She stopped in front of him. "Was that Aldous Webb I passed on the road out of town?" A pause. "I have meetings with various parties in my professional capacity." "Was Crow's lawyer in your bank this morning?" Another pause. Longer. "Mrs. Whitaker, I'm not in a position to discuss." "I'm not asking you to discuss your meetings," she said. "I'm asking you a yes or no question, and I think you know that the answer to that question affects whether the next letter I send goes to the district judge or whether it doesn't need to." He looked at the folder under her arm. He looked at her face. He was the kind of man who had gotten where he was by reading situations accurately, and what he was reading right now was not comfortable for him. "What letter?" he said. She opened the folder and showed him the top page of the timeline. Not the whole thing, just enough. He read the dates and his expression shifted into something that was past discomfort and approaching genuine concern. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said quietly, "whatever you think is happening." "I know exactly what's happening," she said, keeping her own voice at the same calm level she always kept it. "And so do you, Mr. Marsh. The question is whether First Territorial Bank wants to be part of the documented pattern when this reaches a judge, or whether it wants to be on record as having acted in good faith and independently." She paused. "That's not a threat. That's a description of two different situations, and you have the ability to choose which one you're in." He stood very still on the step. "Webb was here this morning," she said. "What was he asking for?" A long beat. Then quietly he asked whether the bank would be willing to reconsider its position on the loan given new information about the property's situation. "What new information?" "The easement filing." Marsh's jaw was tight. He suggested that if the easement went through, the east pasture would be compromised and the loan security significantly reduced. And the bank's response. He looked at her for a moment that stretched. "I told him we'd made our assessment and it stood." She held his gaze. "Did you mean that?" "I meant it when I said it," he said. "I had concerns afterward," and now he looked at the folder. Then at her. And in his face, she saw the thing she'd been watching for the moment when a man who has been sitting uncomfortably in the middle of something decides which way to move. "Webb won't be back," he said. "Not for this." She held his gaze for one more moment to be sure she had read him correctly. Then she closed the folder. "Thank you, Mr. Marsh." She went back to the wagon and climbed up beside Garrett, who had heard none of this from his position on the street, and whose face was a study in disciplined patience. "Well, drive," she said. And when they were clear of the main street, she let herself take one slow breath and release it, because that had been closer than she'd let show, and the relief of its outcome was something she could afford to feel now. "Did it work?" said. "For today," she said. "Crow's not finished, but he's running out of clean moves." She looked at the road ahead. "The next one will be less clean." She was right. Roy came back from Billings on the 7th day. He came in from the yard at midday, and he had the look of a man who has found something he wasn't sure he'd find, and Margaret and Caleb were both in the kitchen when he came through the door. He sat down. He put his hat on the table. He said Gibbs talked. The kitchen went very quiet. He talked, Roy said again, as if confirming it to himself as much as to them. He wasn't hard to find. He was in the boarding house, right where the foreman said. And Roy paused and turned his hat on the table. He looked bad. He'd spent a fair portion of what he'd made, and what he'd made wasn't making him feel good about himself. What did he say? Caleb said. He said Crow's foreman came to him 8 months before he was fired. Offered him money to run the kitchen at a loss. Specific amount of loss, specific methods, the duplicate supply orders, the waste, the bad purchasing. The foreman told him it was to help make the books look bad enough that the bank would be uncomfortable with the loan. Roy met Caleb's eyes. He was paid $200 up front and promised another $100 when the bank called the loan. The silence that followed lasted a full 10 seconds. He'll testify to that? He said he would. Roy looked at her. He said, and this is his words, he said he was tired of looking at himself. He said the money wasn't worth it and it never was, and he'd been knowing that since about a week after he took it. She closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, she was already thinking about what happened next. We need Shard to take a statement from Gibbs, she said. A formal sworn statement before Gibbs changes his mind or Crow finds out he talked and applies pressure. How soon can Shard get to Billings? I asked him on the way back, Roy said. He was already in Briar Falls. He said he could go tomorrow if it was urgent. She looked at Caleb. It's urgent. Caleb was looking at Roy with an expression she had only seen on his face once before in the bank, when Colton said the loan stood. It was the expression of a man who has been holding himself together under pressure for a very long time and has just been given a reason to believe it might hold. Roy, he said. I don't know how to don't, Roy said, with the gruffness of a man who is not comfortable with gratitude and is not going to become comfortable with it. Just tell me when you want me to ride back to Billings with Shard. Tomorrow, Margaret said. Both of you. Take whatever you need. Roy picked up his hat and stood. He paused at the kitchen door and looked back, specifically at Margaret, in the way he'd looked at her that first morning in the doorway, not searching for anything, just acknowledging something that needed to be acknowledged. Ma'am, he said, and then he went out. Caleb waited until the sound of Roy's boots was gone. Then he looked at her. This is it, he said. If Shard can get Gibbs's statement and tie it to the easement filing, Crow is not just going to lose the easement claim. He's going to be in a position where pursuing anything further exposes him to a fraud charge. Yes, she said. You knew, he said. About Gibbs. You suspected it before Roy left. I suspected the shape of it, she said. I didn't know it would hold. But you sent Roy anyway. The only way to know if a thing holds is to put weight on it, she said. You don't learn by looking at it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he did something he hadn't done before. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which were resting flat on the surface in the familiar position she took when she was thinking. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand over hers and let it rest there, solid and warm and entirely deliberate. She looked at their hands. Then she looked at him. We're not done yet, she said. Her voice was quieter than usual. No, he agreed, but we're further along than we were this morning. She turned her hand under his, slowly, until her fingers were threaded through his instead of underneath them. Neither of them made it into more than it was, but it was not nothing. It was, in fact, one of the most honest things that had happened in that kitchen since the first account books came out on her first night, and that was saying something considerable. Outside the ranch moved through its afternoon in the way a working ranch moves, always something that needs doing, always someone doing it. The hands were in the east pasture, the cattle were where the cattle needed to be. The accounts were in order. The legal machinery was turning in the right direction, for the first time. And inside the kitchen, two people who had come into each other's lives through a newspaper advertisement and a practical letter sat with their hands threaded together and didn't need to say anything at all. Because there are some things that have already been said more completely than words can manage. Shard got Gibbs's statement on a Thursday. Roy came back first, riding ahead of the lawyer by half a day, and he came into the kitchen at supper time and set his hat on the table and said, "It's done," and those two words carried the weight of everything they'd been working toward for the past 3 weeks, and everyone in the room felt it at the same time. Margaret set down the ladle. Caleb pushed back from the table. Garrett stopped chewing. Caleb said. Signed it, swore to it in front of Shard and a notary Shard brought from Briar Falls. And gave Shard 3 additional names, 2 of the men Crow's foreman used as go-betweens for the payments, and 1 man in the county recorder's office, who he says confirmed the registration error to the foreman before the easement filing. Roy picked up his hat again and turned it once by the brim. Shard says the additional names changed the shape of the whole case. He said Webb is going to know what's coming before it gets there, and that's going to affect what Webb advises Crow to do next. The kitchen was quiet in the way it got quiet when something big had just shifted. Danny Walsh said, from the end of the table, "What does that mean for us?" "It means Crow has 2 choices," Margaret said. She was still standing at the stove, the ladle in her hand, and she had not moved since Roy said it's done, because she was running the final calculation, and she needed to finish it before she said anything. He can let Shard bring this to the district judge, in which case he faces a fraud inquiry and loses not just the easement case but likely the boundary dispute protections he's had since 1871. She paused. Or he withdraws. He'll withdraw, Garrett said. He said it with the flat certainty of someone who had spent the last 3 weeks studying the situation. A man like Crow doesn't go in front of a judge when he knows what the judge is going to hear. His whole operation depends on being the one with the cleaner hands. He has to withdraw quietly, Margaret said, or he doesn't control the story of why. And if he withdraws quietly, Caleb said slowly, what happens to the fraud evidence? She looked at him. That's Shard's call and yours. Not mine, I'm asking your opinion. She set the ladle down. I think a man who has spent 15 years engineering the slow ruin of his neighbor deserves to have every piece of documentation about that kept in a secure location indefinitely. Not necessarily filed with a court, but kept. She held his gaze. So that if he ever decides to try again, the cost of trying is made clear to him before he begins. The room was quiet for a moment. Roy said that's the right call. Nobody disagreed. Shard arrived the following morning with the signed statement in a leather document case and a particular expression that experienced lawyers get when they know they're holding something decisive. He sat at the kitchen table with Caleb and Margaret and laid out the situation in the plain language he'd told Caleb at their first meeting was the only kind he used. The statement from Gibbs, combined with the Aldrich survey showing the improperly placed stakes, combined with the documented timeline Margaret had prepared, constituted grounds for a fraud and conspiracy claim that would expose Crow, his foreman, and potentially the county recorder to criminal liability under territorial law. Webb, as Crow's legal representative, would be obligated to advise his client of this risk the moment Shard notified him that the evidence existed and a filing was imminent. When do you notify him? Today, Shard said. By messenger this afternoon. Webb will have the information by tonight, he paused. I'd expect a response within 24 hours. In my experience with men in Crow's position, 24 hours is about how long it takes for pride to finish losing its argument with self-preservation. He was right about the 24 hours. The message came not from Webb but from Crow himself, which surprised everyone except Margaret. It was delivered by one of Crow's ranch hands, a young man who looked uncomfortable with his errand, and said nothing except that he had a letter for Mr. Whitaker and was told to wait for a reply. Caleb read the letter at the kitchen table. He read it twice, the way he read things he wanted to be sure he understood correctly. Then he set it down and pushed it toward Margaret without a word. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged that the easement filing had been based on a misunderstanding of the historical use record and that Crow intended to withdraw the filing with the county court by the end of the week. The second expressed a desire to resolve any remaining disagreements regarding the property line through private negotiation rather than legal proceedings. The third, the shortest, said only that Crow hoped this matter could be concluded without further action, and that he wished the Whitaker Ranch continued success. She read it and set it down. He doesn't apologize, she said. No, Caleb said. He doesn't admit to anything specific. No. She looked at the young ranch hand standing uncertainly by the kitchen door. What's your name? Billy, ma'am. Billy, are you hungry? He blinked. Ma'am? It's a simple question. You rode out here from the Crow Range and it's not a short ride. Are you hungry? Yes, ma'am. Sit down. She was already turning to the stove. You'll eat before you ride back. Caleb watched her put a plate in front of a boy who worked for the man who had spent months trying to destroy everything he'd built, without a word of resentment or a moment's hesitation. And he felt something move through him that was too large to have a simple name. She came back to the table while the boy ate, and she said quietly to Caleb, "What do you want to tell him?" He looked at the letter. "I want to tell Crow to go to the devil." "I know," she said. "What do you want to tell him that is actually useful?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, the corner of his mouth moving in something that was almost a smile, he said, "Write it for me." "No," she said. "I'll tell you what to write. You write it." He wrote it, one paragraph. He acknowledged receipt of Crow's letter, stated that he expected the easement filing to be withdrawn by the date specified, noted that he considered the matter of the property line fully and finally settled by the county resolution of 1,871, and said that any future contact regarding shared boundary interests should be directed to his attorney, William Shard of Briar Falls. He did not say he wished Crow well. That was a choice she didn't suggest and he didn't make. Billy ate his meal and took the reply and rode back the way he'd come, and the kitchen settled into the particular quiet of a room where something that has been pressing heavily has just let go. Caleb sat for a moment. Then he put both hands on the table and looked at them, and then he looked at Margaret, who was washing the boy's plate at the basin, and he said, "Is it over?" She dried the plate and put it on the shelf. "For now," she said. Men like Crow don't stop wanting what they want. But the cost of trying again just got high enough that he'll think a long time before he spends it. And if he thinks long enough and decides to spend it anyway, then we'll still have the documents, she said. And he'll know we have them. She turned to face him. That's what the letter to Shard accomplished. Not just stopping this move. Letting him know that every future move comes with the same risk. She paused. Crow is a man who calculates. We just changed the calculation. He looked at her across the kitchen. You changed the calculation. We changed it, she said firmly. All of us in this room. Roy going to Billings. Garrett on the fence line, Danny. Every hand on this ranch who kept working and kept the ranch moving while the legal business was happening. She held his gaze. Don't make it only mine, it won't fit that shape. He was quiet. Then he nodded, not the quick nod of agreement, but the slower one of something genuinely accepted. The news traveled through the ranch the way news always traveled, faster than anyone sent it, in the particular informal current that runs through a community of people who are paying attention. By supper time, all 7 hands knew the easement claim was being withdrawn. The mood at the table that evening was not celebratory. Exactly, these were men who had worked too long in hard country to celebrate prematurely, but it was lighter than it had been in weeks. And the conversation that moved around the table had a different quality from the silence and the short talk of the difficult weeks. Roy said at one point, without looking up from his plate, 9 years I've been on this ranch. Never thought I'd see the day it needed saving by an account book and a kitchen reorganization. And a trip to Billings, Danny offered. And a trip to Billings, Roy agreed. He glanced up at Margaret briefly, the way he always did when he was acknowledging something he wasn't going to make a speech about. She gave him a small nod. That was enough for both of them. After supper, Caleb found her in the kitchen going over the week's accounts, which she did every Friday evening without fail, and he came and sat across from her and watched her work for a moment before he said anything. I've been thinking, he said. About what? About what comes next. He folded his hands on the table. Not the legal part. That's Shard's territory now. I mean, what comes next for the ranch, for the plans? He paused. I want to expand the herd in the spring. I've wanted to do it for 2 years, but the numbers never supported it. She looked up from the accounts. They support it now, he said. The ones you put together for the bank. The projections. With the cost reductions you've made and the supply renegotiations, if we hold through winter the way those numbers say we should, we'll have enough liquidity by spring to add 20 head without touching the loan balance. He paused. I want to do it right this time. Plan it properly. I want you to help me plan it. She looked at him for a moment. Something was happening on her face that she let happen this time, rather than managing it back to neutral. You're planning for a future that includes me here, she said. I am, he said simply. We haven't discussed what this is, she said. What we are, he agreed. We haven't. Do you want to? He held her gaze with the steady directness that was so essentially the gaze of a man who has decided on something and is not going to pretend he hasn't. I want what you want, he said. I know what I want, but I'm aware that you came here under a specific agreement and that nothing obligates you to want more than that, and I'm not going to. He stopped and found the right word. I'm not going to press. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the accounts in front of her, which were neat and current, and exactly what she'd made them, a clean, clear picture of a ranch that was no longer failing. A ranch that was, by every honest measure, on its way to being something better than it had been before she arrived. She thought about Pennsylvania, about her father's house and the years of work that had kept it going and the way she'd done that work without anyone ever quite seeing what it cost or what it was worth. She thought about the train platform in Harlan Creek and the sound of Jim Hasley's laugh and the way Caleb's face had looked in that first moment and how she'd lifted her chin and kept walking because she had learned a long time ago that the only answer to a world that underestimated her was to keep walking and let the work speak. The work had spoken. She looked back at him. I came here, she said carefully, because I needed somewhere that needed what I had. I told you that a long time ago, and this ranch needed it, and I gave it, and that part is the same as it was. She paused. But the rest of it is not the same as it was. What is happening in this kitchen is not what I told myself I was coming for. And I would be dishonest with myself and with you if I pretended it wasn't happening. He was very still. I am not a woman who is easy to be with, she said. I have opinions and I act on them. I keep accounts of things. I don't wait for permission to do what needs to be done. I will always be the person in this house who finds the loose board in the pantry and the error in the filing number and the thing that nobody else thought to look for. She held his gaze. That doesn't go away. I know that, he said. You say that now. I say it having lived in the same house with you for 5 weeks, he said. I know exactly what I'm saying, and I know exactly what I mean. He leaned forward slightly. Margaret, I don't want you to be different. I want you to be exactly who you are, here in this house, for as long as you're willing to be. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the night was deep and still in the way Montana nights got in the late summer, when the heat of the day had finally let go and the dark settled clean and solid over everything. She said, then I'll stay, not as an arrangement. Not as a practical solution, as a choice freely made by a woman who had come a long way to find somewhere worth staying. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. That was all. That was enough. The weeks that followed had a different quality from everything that had come before, not easier exactly, because the work of a ranch in the last weeks before winter is never easy, but settled in a way that the previous weeks hadn't been. Settled the way things get when the fundamental question has been answered, and what remains is the work of building on the answer. Crow withdrew the easement filing on the date he'd specified. Webb sent the notice to Shard, and Shard forwarded it to Caleb, who showed it to Margaret over breakfast, and then put it in the folder with everything else, in the secure location she had designated. Nobody made a celebration of it. It was a document like any other document, filed in its place, doing its job. Garrett rode the east fence line one more time after the withdrawal and came back and said, "Stakes are gone," and that was the end of the conversation. The supply reorganization Margaret had set in motion in her first weeks began to yield the results she'd projected. The new suppliers were more reliable and less expensive than the ones Gibbs had been using, and the savings accumulated the way seems to when a household is run with honest attention, not dramatically, but steadily and without interruption. She kept the accounts with the same weekly precision she'd established from the beginning, and the picture that showed every Friday evening was incrementally better than the picture of the Friday before. Roy stayed. He didn't announce that he was staying, he simply stopped looking like a man who was thinking about leaving, and after a while the question ceased to exist. Garrett stayed. Danny Walsh stayed and wrote a letter home to his mother in Missouri that Roy happened to see over his shoulder one afternoon, and the letter said, among other things, that he'd ended up on a ranch run by a woman who could outthink any man he'd ever met, and could also make biscuits that were worth riding 100 miles for, and that he planned to be here a good while. Danny sealed the letter before Roy could read the rest, which was probably wise. The autumn gathered itself in the way Montana autumns do, coming on fast and without ceremony, and the ranch moved into its winter preparations with the organized efficiency of a household that knows what it's doing. Margaret had made her preserving list in August, had seen the winter coming in the same way she saw everything. With the forward-looking precision of someone who will never let themselves be surprised by the predictable. And the pantry was stocked properly for the first time in at least 2 years, according to Roy, who was the ranch's unofficial keeper of institutional memory. She ordered seeds for the kitchen garden in the spring. She did it in October, which was earlier than anyone had done it before, because early ordering meant first choice of varieties, and she had specific varieties in mind based on what she'd seen the soil could support. Caleb found the order on his desk one morning with a note that said only, Spring Kitchen Garden MB, and he set it on the stack of things to be approved and approved it without discussion. Later, he found her in the kitchen and said MB. She turned from the stove. My name before we were married, she said. Margaret Beatrice Holloway. I've always used both initials. I didn't know your middle name was Beatrice. There's probably still quite a bit you don't know about me, she said. He leaned against the doorframe with the ease of a man fully at home in his own house for the first time in a long time. Then I suppose I'll have to keep paying attention, he said. I suppose you will, she said. She turned back to the stove. He watched her work for a moment in the same way he'd watched her on that very first morning, the efficient economy of movement, the focused attention, the complete absence of performance in anything she did, and he felt the same thing he'd felt that morning but larger now, grown into its full shape. He said, Beatrice. Don't, she said, without turning around, but there was something in her voice that wasn't quite the warning it might have been. I like it. You can like it quietly, he smiled. He went out. The first snow came in November, the way it always came early, and without warning and covering everything in the particular white silence that changes the character of the land and tests the character of everything built on it. The ranch held. The cattle were where they needed to be. The supplies were what they needed to be. The men were ready in the ways that matter for winter on the Montana range, which is to say they were fed and warm and not thinking about leaving. Christmas came quietly at Whitaker Ranch. There was no great event, and no guests, the roads being what they were in December, but there was a table set properly for the first time since before Caleb had taken on his loan, with food that had been thought about and prepared with care. And all 7 hands were at that table, and Roy said grace in the brief, direct way of a man who has things he's actually grateful for, and doesn't need many words to say so. After supper, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with Margaret and he said, Tell me about Beatrice. She looked at him over her coffee cup. What about her? The name, where it comes from. My grandmother, she said. On my mother's side. She was a woman who kept farming through 3 bad winters after my grandfather died, alone, with 4 children under 12. She paused. My mother named me after her, because she said she wanted me to remember that women in our family did not stop when things got hard. He was quiet for a moment. Did you need the reminder? No, she said. But it was good to have it anyway. He reached across the table and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear that had come loose from its pin, the way a man does when the gesture is entirely natural and has stopped requiring any decision. She let him. She had stopped requiring any decision about it, too. Margaret Beatrice Whitaker, he said quietly, trying it. She let the name settle. "That's a good name," she said. "It's a strong name," he said, "for a strong woman." She gave him the look she reserved for things that were true, but didn't require her to agree with out loud. He received it with the ease of a man who had learned to read her language. In the spring that came as Margaret had planned for it, with the supplies in order and the seeds already ordered, and the accounts showing exactly the liquidity, Caleb had hoped for. William Shard sent a letter. The letter was brief. It informed Caleb that a complaint had been filed with the County Oversight Board regarding Harold Finch's conduct as county recorder, based on evidence gathered in connection with the Whitaker property dispute. Finch had resigned. The county board was conducting a review of filings made during his tenure. Shard added, in his own handwriting at the bottom of the typed letter, that Aldous Webb had quietly dissolved his professional relationship with Nathaniel Crowe shortly after the easement withdrawal, which Shard regarded as the most informative development in the entire affair. Caleb read the letter and handed it to Margaret. She read it and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Webb left him. Webb left him." A lawyer who leaves his client after a failed scheme is a lawyer who has calculated that the client is going to keep creating schemes and that the eventual cost of those schemes is more than the retainer is worth. She folded the letter. "Crowe is more alone than he was, and he knows we know it. Should that worry me? A man who's more alone than he was and knows his opponent, knows it is also a man who is less likely to move," she said. "He doesn't have the infrastructure for it anymore." Set the letter on the table. "He's not finished resenting you. But resentment and action are different things." Caleb added 22 head of cattle that spring 2 more than he'd originally planned, because the numbers when Margaret ran them in March supported 2 more. The additional head were quality breeding stock, selected with the same careful attention she brought to everything, purchased from a rancher in Wyoming. She'd found the supply directory she'd carried in her bag from Pennsylvania. Roy said when the new cattle arrived, "This is what the North pasture has been waiting for," and he said it with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been on a piece of land long enough to know what it can do when it's managed right. Garrett became the de facto assistant foreman without anyone assigning him the title, through the natural process of being the man who knew what needed doing and did it. He was better at the job than he'd been at being the man who questioned everything, and he seemed to know it, and that knowledge had settled something in him that made him easier to be around. Danny Walsh turned 21 that spring, and Caleb gave him a day off, and Margaret made him a cake, which was not a thing that had happened for anyone's birthday on this ranch in recent memory. Danny ate 2 pieces and turned red from the top of his ears down and said, "Ma'am, you didn't have to do this," and she said, "I know I didn't have to," and that was the whole of the conversation, but he remembered it for the rest of his life. The first summer passed and then the second. And Whitaker Ranch put down the kind of roots that take more than one good season to grow, the kind that require consistent attention and honest work, and the willingness to face hard things without looking away from them. Margaret ran the household accounts with the same precision she'd brought to them from the first night, and the picture they showed every Friday was a ranch that was not just surviving, but building towards something. She wrote to her younger brother in Pennsylvania in the second year, a letter longer than most she sent, in which she described the ranch and the work and the land, and something of the man she'd married. Though she was not effusive about it, because she had never been effusive about anything. Her brother wrote back and said he'd like to visit, and said he was welcome in summer when the roads were good. He came. He was a quiet man of 24 who had their father's hands and their grandmother Beatrice's eyes. And he stood in the yard on his first morning and looked at the ranch with the kind of attention that people who have heard about something for a long time give it when they finally see it. "It's real," he said. "What did you think it was?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "The way you wrote about it. I thought maybe you were making it sound better than it was." She looked at the ranch around them, the house and the yard and the pastures beyond, the cattle that were where they were supposed to be, the hands moving through their morning work with the ease of men who know their place and are glad of it. "I wasn't," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You seem different." "Do I?" "You seem." He thought about it the way the Holloway family thought about things, carefully and without rushing. You seem like yourself. But more of it, she considered that. That's probably accurate, she said. Caleb came out of the house and shook her brother's hand and said he was glad to have him, with the directness of a man who means what he says and doesn't add to it. Her brother shook his hand back and looked at him with the assessing look of a younger sibling meeting the person his sister has chosen. And whatever he was looking for, he appeared to find it, because something in his expression settled. That evening at supper, her brother said, addressing the table generally, Margaret wrote to me about the ranch having some trouble a couple years back. About there being someone trying to take the property. The table went quiet in the way it did when something that was history was being brought into the present, and then Roy said, there was. What stopped it? Roy looked at Margaret. So did Garrett. So did Danny Walsh and the other hands, and so did Caleb, and what all those looks had in common was the same quality, the clear, direct acknowledgement of where that answer lived. Her brother looked at his sister. She did not say anything for a moment. She set down her fork. She looked at the table full of people around her, the hands who had stayed when they could have left, the man at the head of the table who had seen her clearly in the end. The work of 2 years visible in everything around her, and she said simply, we stopped it. All of us, she said. That's how things get stopped. Her brother nodded slowly and picked up his fork, and the table went back to eating, and the evening moved on the way evenings do on a ranch where people are settled and fed, and not afraid of what tomorrow is going to bring. That night, after supper was done and the kitchen was clean and her brother had turned in, Margaret sat at the table for a few minutes alone with her accounts and her coffee, the way she did every evening. Caleb came in from checking the stock and sat across from her and didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything. And the quiet between them was the best kind, the kind earned by two people who have been through something real together and come out the other side with more than they started with. After a while he said, what are you thinking? She looked at the accounts. Then she looked at him. I'm thinking the East pasture numbers are going to be better than projected at the October count. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, that's not all you're thinking. She was quiet for a moment more. I'm thinking, she said slowly, that I got on a train in Pennsylvania with tube and a practical arrangement, and I am sitting in a kitchen that is mine in every way that matters. In a house full of people who know my name and are glad I'm here. She looked at her hands on the table. I'm thinking that the woman who stepped off that train didn't know this was possible. She looked up at him. And I'm thinking that she would be glad to know. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same way he had the night. Roy came back from Billings with the news that changed everything, and she turned her hand under his, fingers threaded through fingers, the same way she had then. She'd be more than glad, he said. She held his gaze. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that train onto a platform full of people who'd already made up their minds about her. Margaret Beatrice Whitaker let herself feel the full weight of what she had built, not just the ranch accounts and the reorganized kitchen, and the legal victory and the loyal men at her table. All of that, and also this, the hand in hers, the lamp between them. The life that had been waiting on the other side of a practical letter, sent to a practical man who had turned out in the end to be something considerably more. The woman they called Plain had built something extraordinary. The bride nobody expected had become the reason a dying ranch found its future. And she had done it the only way she had ever done anything, with her eyes open, her hands steady, and a quiet, absolute certainty that the work was worth doing and that she was exactly the right person to do it. That was never going to change. Not on this ranch, not in his life, and it never did.